the point isn't definitions for the sake of it, but it's definitions for the sake of having correct perspectives for where US society and where the class struggle is headed. The question of what exactly Trump and the right-wing populists around the world represent is one of the defining political questions of this era. And if we don't have a correct understanding of this question, we won't have a correct perspective for the overall trajectory of US and world capitalism. General Mark Milley and also John Kelly, who was Trump's chief of staff, both of them worked in the first Trump administration, famously said he's a fascist last fall. The liberal media was very excited to talk about that. Kamala Harris was visibly pleased when she was asked point blank, do you think Trump is a fascist? And she said, yes, I do, and was very, very happy to make use of this as a scare tactic. The liberal media is also constantly insinuating this. For instance, there's this article from the New York Times the day after the election, November 6th. It's not even an opinion piece, this is just their reporting. The article is called America Hires a Strongman. And they go on, they say, Donald Trump told Americans exactly what he planned to do. He'd use military force against political opponents, deport millions of immigrants, crush the independence of the Department of Justice, and they go on. And then they report, now America stands on the precipice of an authoritarian style of governance never before seen in its 248-year history. So there's that. There's also Bernie Sanders, for his part, is making authoritarianism one of the main focuses of his current speaking tour. And for what it's worth, the DSA has characterized the Trump administration as a fascist regime in an NPC statement from February. Their new slogan is, to fight fascism, we need socialism, or something like that. And so, given that media environment, it's no wonder that when an ABC poll asked respondents in October, the question was, do you think Trump is a fascist? Defined as, quote, a political extremist who seeks to act as a dictator, disregards individual rights, and threatens or uses force against their opponents. That was the question. 49% of Americans said, yes, Trump is a fascist by that definition. Although we should add that 22% of Americans said that applies to Kamala Harris. So there's a lot of confusion and a lot of hatred for both parties out there. All of this, of course, relies on a series of superficial analogies, mostly looking at his rhetoric and disregard for bourgeois democratic norms, you could say. Plus, of course, the fact that he leans on anti-immigrant chauvinism and other things like that. And so our task is to strip away all of that impressionism, strip away all the hysteria around this, and look at this question as historical materialists, while still tapping in to the healthy instinct among many young people to fight Trump and to give them a clear perspective on what Trumpism actually represents. So for us as Marxists, fascism, of course, is not a term of abuse. It's not a term we want to just throw around lightly or as an insult. It has a scientific meaning, as does the term Bonapartism, for that matter. And the purpose of having scientific terminology is to help us characterize a given regime, and from that, develop perspectives for the class struggle in a given country. And to discuss fascism and Bonapartism in their proper context, I think we have to first start by looking at the basics of the Marxist theory of the state. So, of course, Lenin's summary in the first chapter of State and Revolution, of Engels' writings in particular, is a very good overview of the Marxist theory of the state. Basically, Engels explains, and Lenin quotes him, the state is a product of society at a certain stage of development. It is the admission that this society has become entangled in an insoluble contradiction with itself, that it has split into irreconcilable antagonisms which it is powerless to dispel. But in order that these antagonisms, these classes with conflicting economic interests, might not consume themselves and society in fruitless struggle, it became necessary to have a power seemingly standing above society that would alleviate the conflict and keep it within the bounds of, quote, order. And this power, arisen out of society but placing itself above it and alienating itself more and more from it, is the state. And so we explain as Marxists, essentially, when the productive forces developed to the point that a substantial surplus became possible, classes began to arise, and with that, eventually, the need for a state in order to safeguard the privileged position of the ruling class. And so because of that, we also explain that the state necessarily has a class basis. And Lenin also emphasizes this in chapter 1 of State and Revolution. He writes, according to Marx, The state is an organ of class rule, an organ for the oppression of one class by another. It is the creation of, quote, order, which legalizes and perpetuates this oppression by moderating the conflict between the classes. And then and Engels and Lenin also emphasize that it is not and cannot be a neutral moderator, saying that as a rule, it's going to be the most powerful, economically dominant class, which then through the state becomes the politically dominant class as well. And this is an important point because the reformists basically see the state as a neutral force and a mediator. For instance, you don't really hear this these days, but a few years ago, there was this DSA fantasy scenario of basically getting like a majority in the House of Representatives, or just the idea of like thousands of so-called socialists in office, and from there that somehow we could attain socialism. That's what they're acting on, the assumption that it's a neutral force that the socialist movement can edge its way into. But we understand, though, and Lenin points out, that the state exists because class antagonisms cannot be reconciled, and so the ruling class needs an armed apparatus to protect its position. And the last thing I'll say on this is Lenin also underscores that the power mainly consists of special bodies of armed men having prisons, etc., at their command. And then he also says, how can it be otherwise? That's, when it comes down to it, that's the essence of the state. And this is an essential point for this discussion we're having right now, which is that every capitalist state is ultimately based on naked force. There's different forms of state, and it can become a question of degree, but every capitalist state is ultimately based on naked force. It's true that for most people in the US, which is a bourgeois democracy, the legitimacy of the US state is derived from force of habit, from tradition, the perception of democracy, although that's starting to fray to some degree. But when it comes down to it, the US government's power is reliant above all on armed force, on the police, the National Guard, the army, the prisons, etc. So having established that baseline, we can observe that history shows that the ruling class can make use of several different forms of capitalist states depending on the situation. And I'll read a somewhat long quote from Ted Grant in Democracy or Bonapartism in Europe, which was sent out for this meeting. If you haven't read it yet, it's such an amazing document on this topic, and I cannot recommend it enough. So Ted Grant, early on, he writes, the political character of a regime, Bonapartist, fascist, democratic, is basically determined by the relations between the classes in the nation, which vary at different stages. Its fundamental nature, like its class basis, is determined by its mode of production and property relations. Thus, the regimes of Hitler and Roosevelt, of Attlee and Mussolini, of Franco and Guon, of Perón and Salazar, of De Valera and Chiang Kai-shek are all governments of the capitalist class, for they rest upon the economy of capitalist exploitation. But then he goes on, he says, however, the class nature of these regimes does not exhaust the problem. We have to classify the instrument which differs in each case by which the bourgeoisie ensures its dominance and rule. And then I think this next paragraph really ties it together. He says, the character of this rule is decided not only by the subjective wishes and needs of the finance capitalists, which remain but one factor in the process, but precisely by the objective-subjective interrelations between the classes at a given stage, which has been predicated by the previous history and the development of the class struggle of the given country. And so in other words, the ruling class's intentions and desires are one aspect, but ultimately we're looking at the overall development of the class struggle and the particular history of a given country, which is going to determine the nature of the capitalist state. And that's the axis of this whole discussion, ultimately. We're looking at the different possible types of capitalist states, how they form and evolve in accordance with the development of the class struggle. I think before getting into that, though, we also have to understand the role and the limits of categorization, because the point of Marxist analysis is not to just pigeonhole every single phenomenon neatly into a category. We know as materialists that all categories and descriptions are imperfect reflections of real phenomena. And it's worth noting that in his article on Bonapartism and Fascism, at the very beginning, Trotsky says that the most important law of dialectics is that the truth is always concrete. We don't start with abstract categories and then try to make reality conform to them. We study phenomena concretely, and in doing so, we can develop and make use of classifications to the degree that they're useful. Ted Grant also summarizes this point, basically saying there's so many factors involved that it's necessary to examine each regime concretely before categorically defining its position, and points out that you can name a series of countries that are bourgeois democracies, England, Switzerland, the US, Weimar Germany, the Republic of Ireland. And he says they all have wide differences, but they do remain democracies. But despite these diverse histories, they have certain common traits which are decisive in determining the Marxist classification. And then he goes on to explain some of the main considerations behind what a bourgeois democracy is, which I'll speak to a bit more later on. So with any regime, to have a really clear understanding, it's not sufficient to just categorize it as bourgeois democracy or Bonapartism or fascism, and then leave it at that. Above all, we have to look at it concretely and analyze what is it developing from, where is it going, what are the relations between the classes, and what stage is the class struggle passing through. And then also we have to understand that there's going to be some situations that don't fit neatly into one of those categories. And lastly, we want to understand that ultimately democratic versus dictatorial methods for a capitalist state lie on a spectrum to some degree. So these are some things we have to keep in mind. So to start with bourgeois democracy, in characterizing a regime as such, some general features that we'd identify would be independent workers' organizations, the right to strike, organize, vote, assemble, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. These are some of the general defining features of a bourgeois democracy and bourgeois democratic institutions to express those things through. And Ted Grant adds that it's not the loss of this or that right that would signify a change in the character of the regime, but the totality of the relations. We've often explained that this type of regime is the bourgeoisie's preferred method of ruling, and I think there's a couple reasons for that. And this comes up in State and Revolution as well. Lenin and Engels explained that in a democratic republic, wealth exercises its power indirectly, but all the more surely. For one thing, it allows for broader control by the capitalist class as a whole. We know that the capitalist class is not homogeneous. They can and do have conflicting interests amongst themselves. And so, all things being equal, the ideal form of state for them is one where the different wings of the capitalist class can exert input over the state to some degree, which Marx explains functions generally as the executive committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie. So that's one benefit, but there's also the additional benefit that it provides more safe channels for expression of discontent from the masses. The ruling class can use elections, freedom of speech and assembly, and even the workers' organizations themselves to let off steam. So for instance, in France, the unions regularly schedule so-called days of action, which is one planned day of strikes and demonstrations, and it's planned in advance that that's going to be the end of it. And so the function, the hope from the labor bureaucracy is that that can let off some steam, give the appearance that the leadership of the workers' organizations are addressing something, and then call it. A different instance of that could be America today, where the ruling class right now really does not have to worry about the leadership of the working class because it's so entirely subservient to the capitalists. We talked this morning about how right now, this month, is probably the most favorable moment in modern US history to break with the Democrats. And yet, on a mass scale, there's nothing approaching a serious effort to do that, either from Sanders or from the AFL-CIO. So these are some benefits. The question could arise, though, why don't the capitalists always make use of this form of state if it's more optimal? But we know capitalism is not always in a position of strength to allow that. And Trotsky developed this idea in the late 1930s. He made this point in some of the discussions on the transitional program, that the democratic regime is the most aristocratic way of ruling. It is possible only to a rich nation. And he said, every British Democrat has 9 or 10 slaves working in the colonies. The antique Greek society was a slave democracy. And he says the same, in a certain sense, can be made of some of the other imperialist countries at that time. But he also emphasizes that there's nothing eternally fixed about this aristocratic position of the imperialist countries. He basically says it's a question of tempo. Italy was the poorest of the European imperialist powers and fell to fascism first. He says Germany also, in comparison to, say, Britain, was poorer, didn't have colonies, and fell to fascism. And then in this context, he's making the point that you can't rule out that Britain and the US and France could follow. I think the way he's emphasizing this is somewhat specific to the context of the 30s, the World Depression, the rise of fascism in Europe. But the general point he's making is very important. The liberal view is that if you create democratic institutions, if you create so-called civil society, then wealth and prosperity are going to come as a consequence of that. But in reality, it's the opposite. It's the capitalist countries that are the strongest and wealthiest where the struggle for survival is less acute, that are able to afford more bourgeois democracy, or more elements of bourgeois democracy. Those countries can allow certain channels for the masses to express their discontent. Whereas in the backwards countries, where the struggle for survival is more acute and where capitalism is more unstable on a constant basis, the ruling class tends to require a state that leans more openly on direct force rather than maybe just the threat of violence, and maybe they'll combine that with limited democratic institutions. It's not a mechanical one-to-one relationship. You could have situations where the economic basis that gave rise to a given regime has eroded, but the regime itself hasn't changed. It's not mechanical, but ultimately those are the general parameters. I think another thing to mention on bourgeois democracy is that there is no such thing as pure democracy, pure bourgeois democracy. Even within the freest capitalist democracies, you inevitably see limitations on democratic rights if and when the ruling class requires it, as well as the use of state violence. The US government, for instance, imprisoned Eugene Debs for opposing World War I, or even much more recently, Germany banned pro-Palestine demonstrations, especially early on in the Gaza war, and there were similar incursions on democratic rights in other European countries. This is from a New York Times article on this, and this is quite clear-cut. Basically, this woman said she was at the sidelines of a pro-Palestine protest, not even actively participating, but wearing a keffiyeh. The police pushed her friend to the ground, or your friend was wearing it. The police pushed her friend to the ground, pinned him down for several minutes, and arrested him. She filmed the episode while demanding an explanation. Instead of getting an answer, she too was briefly detained and accused of resisting the police. So this is in democratic, civilized Germany, where when the push comes to shove, the state is willing to make incursions on free speech and freedom of assembly. That doesn't mean that Germany is not a bourgeois democracy, or that the US wasn't a bourgeois democracy during World War I. It just shows that under capitalism, democracy is always limited by definition. And when so-called emergency situations for the capitalist class arise, then they're going to take emergency measures to curb democratic rights. And so we as communists defend those rights, but we link it to the struggle for socialism. We explain that's the only way to achieve consistent democracy. So that's bourgeois democracy. But as we know, it's not always the case that the capitalists can rely on democratic means to maintain their rule. There can arise Bonapartist or fascist dictatorships, as well as transitional forms of state between these basic forms. So to start with Bonapartism and to return to state and revolution again, Lenin, paraphrasing Engels, writes the following: by way of exception, periods occur in which the warring classes balance each other so nearly that the state power as ostensible mediator acquires for the moment a certain degree of independence of both. And he gives the examples of Bonapartism in the First and Second Empires in France and the Bismarck regime in Germany. So there can be situations where society is in an extreme state of crisis and where the class struggle basically reaches a deadlock or an equilibrium. No one class is able to fully assert its rule given the underlying crisis of society. And in that case, the state can partially raise itself above society and balance off the different classes to stabilize the situation. And they're going to have to make use basically of a military police dictatorship to enforce this. That's the essence of Bonapartism, is rule by the sword, a military dictatorship. But we should emphasize a few things. For one thing, while the state may attain a certain degree of independence, it's still ultimately going to be defending the rule of the economically dominant class. You cannot have a state that has no class basis whatsoever. The army doesn't have its own independent interests to assert. It's going to have to defend, in the case of bourgeois Bonapartism, capitalist property relations, even if the capitalists are not directly in control of the state. The namesake, of course, for this phenomena was Napoleon Bonaparte himself, but there's other examples we can look at too. An example Trotsky uses is the Primo de Rivera dictatorship that came to power in Spain in 1923. And this comes up in some of Trotsky's earliest writings on fascism. He points out that the Stalinist Comintern had characterized this regime as fascist, and in general very loosely used that term. But Trotsky points out first and foremost that de Rivera did not lean on the non-proletarian masses, on the plebeian masses to come to power and smash the workers' organizations. It was a regime with a much more fragile base. It was a Bonapartist military dictatorship, not a fascist dictatorship. And so yeah, this relatively small base for Bonapartism is an important aspect of it because it has an impact on perspectives for how the class struggle can play out in that scenario. So yes, there's no mass base. It rests on the police and the military, and so it's going to be less stable than, for instance, a fascist regime. And depending on how the Bonapartist regime came into existence, it might be highly, highly unstable. In the case of Rivera, he came to power in 1923 in a coup. By 1931, that regime was overthrown and the Spanish Republic was declared. So the point being is that it had been characterized as fascism by the Comintern, but it wasn't a stable, long-lasting dictatorship with deep roots in society. It was very unstable. So that's one aspect of it. Also, because of this relatively weak base for a military dictatorship, the possibility of completely eradicating the workers' organizations is not there. To use an example of that, I was looking into this a bit. Brazil had a military dictatorship which came to power in 1964. And to be sure, it was an extremely brutal, repressive regime. We're obviously not saying that these regimes are not repressive or pleasant or anything like that, but it had a base in the military. And the regime, it did assassinate certain workers' leaders. It exiled union leaders. It definitely tried, and to some degree, to an important degree, succeeded in repressing the trade union movement. But it never succeeded in completely eradicating the unions or completely, making them entirely subservient to the state. They still maintained some degree of existence, although weakened. And in fact, the coup the dictatorship came to power in 1964. There were some strikes, not that many, but there were some strikes in the years that followed. In 1978, though, there was a major strike wave of metal workers in Brazil, which significantly weakened that regime. It had to open up a bit more and loosen its repressive measures. And then by 1988, the regime was so weak that basically there was a return to bourgeois democracy, which the working class forced, essentially. So that's an example. A different example would be the bourgeois Bonapartist regime in Russia today, because that's not a bourgeois democracy. It has rigged elections. It's a police state, but there are still unions. I won't go into detail on this, but I do want to mention, while we're talking about Bonapartism, that I'm talking specifically about bourgeois Bonapartism. But of course, there's also proletarian Bonapartism, which is what Stalinism was. So just to mention that. So we can counterpose bourgeois Bonapartism to fascism, which is a very particular form of authoritarian state. Unlike a Bonapartist regime, a fascist state has a mass base in the form of the enraged middle-class layers and lumpenproletariat. And so because it basically has a mass movement behind it, and it's able to accomplish a much more thorough eradication, basically, of the workers' organizations than a military dictatorship could. I think there's a very good explanation of this in the opening chapter of the book on the Spanish Revolution by Felix Moro, which I'll try to just paraphrase, but it's worth noting. He says, "Fascism is a special form of reaction, the product of the period of capitalist decline. To see this fully, one only has to compare Franco's regime with that of the monarchy. The last Alfonso's record is a bloody account of massacres of peasants and workers, of terrorism and assassination of proletarian leaders. Yet, side by side with the systematic measures of repression, the monarchy permitted a restricted existence to economic and political organizations of the working class and to municipal and national organs of parliamentary democracy." He gives some other examples. Even under the Primo de Rivera dictatorship, the Socialist Party and the UGT led a legal existence. He says, similarly, a system of legal unions and social democratic parties existed in the empires of Wilhelm and Franz Joseph. And even under Tsar Nicholas, there was a measure of legality for unions, cooperatives, and the labor press, in which the Bolsheviks were able to work even though they themselves were illegal. And he points out Pravda had a circulation of 60,000 in 1912 to 1914. As contrasted to these reactionary regimes, the special character of fascism consists in its extirpation of any and all independent organizations of the working class. So I think that contrast puts it very well. Fascist regimes, again, can accomplish this because they have a mass movement, millions of non-proletarian elements behind them, and even some layers of the working class, which are essentially used as a battering ram against the working class. And there's a common thread for how fascism emerged historically. Whenever it came to power, for one thing, it was only after the working class had been decisively defeated. Basically, the working class had tried and failed to take power due to a crisis of leadership. In Italy, there had been the massive factory occupation movement in 1919 to 1920. I just recently, by the way, there's a lead-off by Fred Weston on the British section's YouTube channel, which is really excellent. It's something that's example of fascism that we don't always study in as much detail, but that's a really good resource. And we call it a factory occupation movement. It was a revolutionary situation in Italy from 1919 to 1920, extremely promising situation for the working class to take power. And the Communist Party didn't exist yet. The Socialist Party did not want to take power, and the relatively small Italian working class was defeated. In Germany, of course, there was the whole revolutionary period from 1918 to 1933. And in Spain, there was the Spanish Revolution, which dragged out from 1931 to 1937. So the proletariat was defeated in all of these cases, and yet the crisis of capitalism, which had given rise to those revolutions, had not been resolved either. Capitalism was still in a state of decline and decomposition. The ruling class required stability, and in order to do that, I should note too, they themselves had tried other options. They wanted to stabilize their system as well. And as a very last resort, they turned to the fascists, who previously had been a marginal group in society. The ruling class prefers to work with its own people, with the generals and these kinds of people, compared to the fascists, which are ultimately a more outside grouping. But as a last resort, the ruling class decided it was necessary to turn towards the fascists. And again, they were only able to accomplish this once the working class was completely exhausted and defeated. And when we say destroying the workers' organizations, we're talking about the physical annihilation of all traces of the workers' organizations. In Italy, for instance, starting around late 1920, the fascists basically started going town to town systematically. They would burn down the union headquarters, burn down the Socialist Party headquarters. Once the Communist Party came into existence, that too, either execute the leaders of these organizations or have them flee. So it was a terror campaign, town to town, to destroy the unions and the workers' parties. And the Socialist Party, by the way, was basically calling on the Italian bourgeois state to stop this, but the Italian ruling class itself had decided this was necessary and was funding it. So that was going to be impotent by definition. Or we can take the example, the most famous classical example of fascism in Germany. And the Nazis came to power in March 1933. The German labor movement was the strongest and best organized in the world. There were 7 million members of the trade unions. The KPD had around 300,000 members the year before Hitler came to power. The Social Democratic Party had 1 million members. And the Nazis' very first priority was to completely destroy all of that, to destroy the Communist Party, destroy the Socialist Party, illegalize the unions, the independent unions. The KPD was illegalized within weeks. The Nazis confiscated all of their offices and assets. On May 2nd, the trade union offices were occupied and turned into houses of German labor. The right to strike was abolished on May 16th. Soon after, the trade unions were just dissolved. Their funds were confiscated. Their leaders were loaded into trucks and taken to concentration camps. On June 23rd, the SPD was also banned. And they had actually tried to, the top of the SPD had tried to make peace with the Nazis, but they were also banned, and that didn't work for them. The leaders were also arrested. And as we often point out, the very first concentration camps that the Nazi regime built were for political prisoners, mostly communists, but also social democrats and trade unionists. So not only that, though, but we have the whole point of fascism is that it has a mass base facilitating this. There's millions of people within the German population, enraged small shopkeepers and other middle-class types that had also been driven into a frenzy, into despair by the crisis of German capitalism. So there's millions of these layers who are helping to enforce this, acting as spies for the Nazi state, essentially. And so that's a qualitative difference. It's one thing if the police and the military are trying to repress the population. It's an entirely different thing, especially in a country like Germany, where there's a large petty bourgeois layer. For every block, every shop, every apartment, there could be people, neighbors, relatives who support the Nazi regime and are basically allowing the fascists to have or acting as this deep penetration of German society. So yes, suffice it to say, this is clearly not even close to the situation in the US today. Trump is in office. He's been in office before. We've been selling the paper, holding public meetings. We can act very openly. That would not be even remotely possible in the context of a fascist state. Not to mention the fact that the class basis for fascism, the petty bourgeois layers specifically, has been whittled down substantially, which I'll speak about a bit more later on. So in looking at these different forms of states, I think we also have to emphasize that the form of capitalist state at a given time is not fixed for eternity. You can and inevitably will have periods where the intensity of the class struggle is such that the state undergoes transformations. Possibly you could have multiple significant transformations in a relatively short space of time. And it shows us that we have to be concrete in how we analyze different regimes and view society as a process of development, not something that's static. I'll quote Ted Grant again, because I think this puts it so well. He said in this reply to Pierre Frank, "The experience of history has shown, and events now unfolding in Europe demonstrate irrefutably, that the methods of the bourgeoisie in its struggle against the proletarian revolution vary widely and are not determined a priori. The bourgeoisie makes use of different methods, relies on different strata, depending on the class relation of forces in order to reinforce or reestablish its rule." And then he goes on to say whether they maneuver with the reformists and the Stalinists, or Bonapartists or fascist auxiliaries, or he says, as sometimes happens, whether they use all of these things simultaneously, it does not depend on the subjective intentions of the ruling class, but on the objective conditions and interrelations between the classes in the nation. But he emphasized the bourgeoisie is very flexible, maintains extreme flexibility, manipulating regimes according to the resistance of the masses, the class forces, etc. I think the history of Germany gives a really clear example of this. You had, starting in 1871, I think, Bismarck united Germany in a Bonapartist fashion and formed the German Empire. That eventually became a regime which I think doesn't really fit neatly into either category, but it did have considerably repressive measures, had Bonapartist tendencies. But by the 1890s, the anti-socialist laws were over, and the workers' organizations were able to function openly. Then you had the revolution, the German Revolution of 1918, which was defeated due to a crisis of leadership. At that time, the German capitalists regrouped around a bourgeois democracy, the Weimar Republic, which Ted Grant explains was a counter-revolutionary regime in a democratic form. And so then you had an unstable bourgeois democracy formed as the consequence of a defeated proletarian revolution. Then, on the basis of deepening crisis of capitalism in Germany, by around 1930, what Trotsky characterized as pre-Bonapartist regimes and then eventually Bonapartist regimes came into power, developed, you could say. The fascists then took power in 1933 and constructed a fascist state, as I talked about. And then by the mid to late 1930s, the Nazis had lost their mass base. The fascists can't maintain the frenzied petty bourgeoisie in this state indefinitely. They use it as a battering ram to crush the labor movement, but eventually they can't maintain that forever. So fascism, after coming into power, eventually transforms into Bonapartism, although that's concrete too, because Trotsky points out, and the experience in Germany shows, that a Bonapartist regime that comes into existence in the wake of fascism tends to be much more stable than a pre-fascist Bonapartist regime. So that was the situation. Then after World War II, the presence of the Red Army across Eastern Europe led to the formation of a series of new deformed worker states, including East Germany. Meanwhile, the US helped rebuild West Germany, which eventually became a quite stable bourgeois democracy. East German Stalinism fell in 1990. You have a unified German bourgeois democracy. And now, as the crisis of European capitalism reaches this kind of tipping point, German capitalism has become very unstable yet again, and its bourgeois democracy is also becoming much more unstable compared to the recent past, although not on the scale of, for instance, the Weimar Republic yet. And so all this shows, we have to, again, approach this as a process. It's not fixed. You can have all kinds of transformations in the form of state that the capitalists use to maintain their rule. Although that doesn't mean it's always on the verge of changing at the same time. We have to look at it concretely and look at the class balance of forces. And so that brings me to the US today, which I think we should look at in light of basically the Marxist theory of the state. Because it's one thing to analyze these changes with hindsight. We can see this process very clearly looking back at German history, for instance. But what we're aiming to do by developing perspectives is monitor this process in real time, monitor the changes in the stability of capitalism economically and politically in real time. And at one point in the reply to Pierre Frank, Ted Grant is contrasting Frank's schematic method with the Marxist method. And Ted Grant gives some general criteria for assessing the character of a given regime, which I think summarizes it very well. He says the Marxist appreciation, unlike Pierre Frank's method, would be to ask, what was the development of the regime? From what to what is it evolving? What is the position of the classes? What are the relations between the classes? And I think we can add to that as an extension, through what stage is the class struggle passing? And I think if we apply this criteria to the US right now, we can get an insight on the situation. So to start with this first question, Ted Grant asks, from what to what is the US evolving? The US is evolving from a bourgeois democracy that enjoyed exceptional stability, where there's almost nothing like it in the whole history of capitalism, to a bourgeois democracy that no longer has unchallenged imperialist domination over the rest of world capitalism, and therefore has a much greater degree of political instability than in the past. For instance, this is insane when you compare it to today. In 1964, I think this is a Gallup poll, 77% of the US population said that they trust the government. And that's now down to 22% as of 2024. So there's been a huge, we've been discussing this for the past year, huge collapse in confidence in all bourgeois democratic institutions in the last 80 years. In that context, Trump, as a demagogic outsider, has captured the presidency twice now. And that is significant. In fact, right-wing populism is a highly significant development in the sense that it shows that the political stability that Western Europe and America enjoyed for many decades is coming to an end. But of course, we have to be level-headed and maintain a sense of proportion and look at it soberly. The US is still a bourgeois democracy, and that is not at all likely to change in the short or medium term because of the class balance of forces. It's not categorically ruled out that some kind of military solution could ever occur, but right now it's not in the cards. And as we've been doing, we need to keep politically pushing back against any scaremongering to the contrary. I can point out that Trump did not impose a Bonapartist or fascist dictatorship during his first term. He's not doing that right now. And he's not able to do that right now because the class balance of forces precludes it, which takes to the next question, if you will, on the position of the classes. For one thing, the working class has never been larger as an overall proportion of society and of the workforce. It's been massively strengthened by capitalist development since the interwar period, for instance, in all of the advanced capitalist countries. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, publishes data on the different industries and the overall US workforce. And for 2023, total wage and salary employment, which we can use as a proxy for wage earners, for workers, there was 158 million wage and salary employees, which you can compare to 9 million, or round up to 10 million self-employed workers. So that means that about 5.8% of the US workforce is self-employed. So a classical fascist dictatorship would, basically you'd have that 5.8% trying to physically destroy the organizations that could be created by the 158 million. It's the point being, the working class is massively, has the upper hand numerically compared to the middle classes, to the self-employed layers. Some other points on the class composition or the class balance of forces. There was a recent article in the Washington Post asking, is America still a nation of small businesses? And it's worth reading because a lot of people still assume that, but it's basically pointing out that when you look at the data, that is not true at all anymore. The article points out that 53% of the US workforce works for businesses with 500 or more workers. And in fact, this statistic was even more striking to me. 29% of the US workforce, which is 39.1 million people, work for businesses that employ 10,000 or more workers. So the economy is massively consolidated and the workforce heavily proletarianized, which suggests that the class basis for fascism has been severely eroded since the time of European fascism in the interwar period. Also, another way of looking at this is small business owners, or how many small businesses there are. And there a couple years ago, The Guardian published this article pointing out that I guess the Census Bureau says there's 32 million small businesses, but they look into that in more detail and find that most of those are people who have some kind of small side income and have to report that as a small business. But if you actually look at how many bona fide small businesses are there, this estimates that there's somewhere around 7.8 million small businesses. And again, the Bureau of Labor Statistics says there's around 9.7 self-employed workers. So that gives us a rough idea of the small size of the petty bourgeoisie at this time. And so we also want to ask, what are the relations between the classes and through what stage is the class struggle passing? And this is something we've been discussing through our whole history, especially in the last year since launching the RCA. We've been kind of looking at the big picture of the changes in consciousness in the US working class that have occurred in the last few decades. So among the proportionally massive working class, we know there's huge discontent. Real wages have stagnated or fallen for decades. The cost of living has risen massively. This has been the general picture for US capitalism since the 70s. It's been in relative decline since the 70s. And I think over the past decade and a half, the working class has started to wake up to this situation. That's the early years of the post-2008 period, where you saw the illusions in Obama and then the rise of Sanders and Trump. All of that as an expression of, on a mass consciousness, on a mass scale, realizing that things are not as good as they used to be or as they were for previous generations. So there's huge anger, there's huge potential to fight, willingness to fight. But parallel with that, we have probably the weakest, most politically degenerate proletarian leadership in history. They're totally, qualitatively different than in the past in many ways, totally subservient to the capitalists and giving no real channel for this widespread discontent. Sanders, for instance, back in 2016, we observed that he actually had quite a bit of sympathy among Trump voters. And he still, obviously with the rallies, he still has general sympathy and even support among certain layers, young people. But at least in terms of appearing as a true outsider that even Trump voters could respect, he's lost that because he attached himself to the Democrats firmly ever since 2016 and has become viewed as an appendage of them at most. The AFL-CIO is likewise totally wedded to the capitalists, giving no serious lead. Again, now would be the most opportune time in modern history for them to just make a few press releases, even a half-hearted campaign in the direction of a class independent workers' party, I think would spread like wildfire in this current situation, but there's no trace of that. And so as we've explained, in this context, Trump is the only mass political option giving a voice to this hatred of the establishment that has developed. And in this sense, much unlike a bourgeois Bonapartist or fascist dictatorship, right-wing populism, as we're calling it, actually contains a progressive kernel. It represents a rejection of the status quo among a wide layer of the working class, albeit in a distorted form. It could be channeled to the left if given the option, but right now there is no mass option on the left, and so it's being channeled to the right. So as always, we have to separate the progressive features from the accidental or reactionary features. I think too, in many ways, right-wing populism is a novel and peculiar historical phenomenon. It's enabled by this unprecedented degeneration of the traditional workers' organizations across the world. Some other things we have to take note of would be the mood and morale of the working class. The US working class is not a working class that's been exhausted after a decade or two of intense struggle. It's the opposite. It's a working class that's just starting to wake back up after this anomaly period of relative class peace. And I think this is one of the most important reasons for insisting on precision here with regards to fascism or not. The establishment of a fascist state would signify that the working class has been exhausted and decisively defeated after a long period of struggle. We would be saying, possibly for several decades, there's not going to be a significant movement of the US working class, or at least that it'd be highly unlikely. Our perspective in the US right now, and in virtually every advanced capitalist country, is the exact opposite. We're saying that after this 80-year post-war anomaly period, that's finally coming to a close and putting class struggle and eventually world revolution squarely on the agenda. And therefore, Trumpism is not a strong, cohesive, dictatorial state at all. We point out as Marxists that it's not about Trump's subjective aims or desires. We can speculate about that, but that's it. The reality is that right now, there's no significant wing of the ruling class that is looking for a military solution to the given situation. On the contrary, I think the far-sighted bourgeoisie understand that any attempt to impose that would provoke the working class massively and totally explode in their faces. If you really imagine if Trump genuinely tried to impose a military dictatorship, or anyone genuinely tried to do that on the roughly 160 million strong working class, the fight back, the response would be absolutely enormous, historic. The working class could sweep that aside, and in doing so could get a sense of its power, and it would just massively destabilize the situation. So that would be totally self-defeating. I think the bourgeoisie right now wants to restabilize bourgeois democracy. Of course, they're going to find that that's not easier said than done, but that's what they're looking towards in the main. Only after a long period of struggle might they be able to consider a military solution. So of course, there's a lot of demagogic rhetoric, and certainly there's important differences we've discussed with imperialist foreign policy. You know, Trump is unlike any other president. We don't want to overcorrect and say that Trump is a normal bourgeois politician, because he's definitely not. But he's certainly not a Bonapartist or fascist strongman. There's the question of whether there's elements of Bonapartism has also been raised. But I think if we emphasize that, it can cause confusion more than anything, because we can find elements of Bonapartism in many situations. In fact, I think in the Ted Grant piece, it points out that by virtue of being a force that raises itself above society to moderate class conflict, there's the possibility of Bonapartism's presence in any state. So you can always find elements and look at it that way. But to quote Ted Grant, he says, there's many points of similarity between these regimes, between these three kinds of regimes, and elements of naked military rule in all these regimes in one degree or another. But quantity changes into quality. What dictates the nature of the regime is not this or that element, but its basic features. And the basic features of the present regime in the US right now are certainly those of bourgeois democracy. There has not been any fundamental incursions on US bourgeois democracy. Again, Trump clearly has disdain for the usual norms of conduct. So, you know, there's differences, but we're clearly not living under a military dictatorship, and we're not on the verge of that either. It's true that Trump, one of his differences is that he leans much more openly on open racism, open chauvinism than other presidents in modern history, at least. And so we can see why young people are alarmed by the rise of Trump. And it's inevitable that we're going to keep hearing this idea again and again. The point isn't definitions for the sake of it, but it's definitions for the sake of having correct perspectives for where US society and where the class struggle is headed. But I would say this, right now, there's a huge amount of economic discontent in society. Wages have been declining for decades. People can't find good jobs. There's a cost of living crisis. And in the last election, the Democrats basically pretended that that wasn't the case. They said, the economy is doing great. America's best days are ahead of us. They're viewed correctly as the establishment. Trump is basically the only person giving a voice to that discontent on a mass scale, and he comes across as an outsider. He was saying, this is a nation in decline. We need to make huge changes. We're going to bring wealth back to America and create the biggest economic boom in history. He's saying he's going to create millions of manufacturing jobs, all of this. And so I think given the circumstances, it's no wonder people voted for him. And so I don't think that's fascism. I think it's just a sign that there's a deep hatred of the political establishment, and that Trump is a harbinger of future instability and class struggle on the horizon, because it's economic decline that's given rise to his movement, but it's also going to give rise to a huge revival of the class struggle, which we need to prepare for. And to do that, we need to reject both parties. The liberals have presided over this decline. People are correct to hate them. And the lefts, like Bernie Sanders, support the liberals and blend in with the establishment. And for now, that's given Trump a monopoly on the anti-establishment vote. And so we have to build a class-independent alternative, a communist party that can eventually channel all of this anger at capitalism. Because as we've emphasized, eventually the workers who support Trump are going to become disillusioned with him. He's not going to be able to deliver, and that will prepare a swing to the left that we have to prepare for. So comrades, I think if we successfully convey our analysis of Trump, if we successfully convey the essence of Trumpism, we can give the comrades clarity and inspiration to build the party, and to understand the rise of Trumpism as a part of the molecular process of revolution which is developing in this country.